You are a complete failure, Dad. Mom's new husband actually has money. My son spat those words across the fine linen of the dinner table, his face twisted in a mixture of arrogance and disgust. I just stared at him. I stayed perfectly silent, not because I was crushed, but because that very same morning I had signed a corporate acquisition contract that made me a billionaire. He thought he was taking everything from me. He had no idea I was about to buy his entire world and legally evict him from it. Before I get into exactly how I taught my greedy son and his new family a lesson they will never forget, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with ungrateful family members who mistook your quiet kindness for weakness. Now let me take you back to the dinner where my son signed his own financial death warrant. The air inside the grand dining room of the Wellington Steakhouse smelled of roasted garlic, aged beef, and old money. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, feeling the rough fabric of my 10-year-old gray suit jacket against my wrists. It was a practical suit, kept clean and pressed, but the frayed cuffs told the story of a retired mechanical engineer living on a fixed pension. Across from me sat the sharp contrast of my own flesh and blood. My son Matthew wore a custom-tailored Italian suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. His silk tie caught the dim amber light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. Beside him sat his wife Samantha. She wore a backless emerald dress and kept adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, making sure every waiter who passed by noticed the heavy stones on her wrist. At the head of the table sat Philip Montgomery, the man who had replaced me. My ex-wife Barbara leaned into Philip's shoulder, laughing loudly at a joke he had just told. Barbara had left me 5 years ago. She had packed her bags after declaring she could no longer tolerate the smell of motor oil and the endless hours I spent in my dusty garage working on my engineering patents. She wanted a life of luxury, and she found it in Philip, a man who boasted loudly about his sprawling commercial real estate empire. I sipped my black coffee and watched them. Philip dominated the conversation, his booming voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He ordered the most expensive bottles of imported wine without glancing at the prices. He regaled Matthew with stories of his latest European vacation, describing the private yachts in Monaco and the luxury suites in Paris. Matthew hung on every single word. My son looked at Philip with a deep, reverent admiration that he had never once directed toward me. I remained quiet, letting Philip fill the silence with his ego. I remembered the countless overtime shifts I took at the manufacturing plant to afford Matthew's tuition at his elite business school. I remembered driving a car with a failing transmission for 6 years just so Matthew could live in an upscale dormitory and network with wealthy students. I had sacrificed my own financial security to launch his life, and now he sat across from me, treating me like an embarrassing stranger who had wandered into his private club. The waiters arrived, clearing the expensive porcelain plates from the table. The lavish dinner was over, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The forced smiles vanished. Matthew leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and signaled to Samantha. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, yellow manila envelope. She tossed it onto the table. It landed right next to my coffee cup with a heavy thud. Matthew looked me in the eye, his voice dropping to a cold, businesslike tone. He told me that his tech startup was expanding and that he needed to secure a massive line of credit by the end of the week. He explained that the venture capital firms were demanding hard collateral, something tangible, to back the loans. He tapped his manicured finger against the yellow envelope and stated that inside was a standard property transfer agreement. He wanted the deed to my house. I looked down at the envelope, my heart beating at a slow, steady rhythm. The house was a modest 3-bedroom suburban build. It was the only asset I had left. It was the home where Matthew had taken his first steps. I asked him calmly where exactly he expected me to live if I signed away the roof over my head. Samantha scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were a child asking a stupid question. She leaned across the table and told me that the house was practically falling apart anyway. She insisted that my neighborhood was declining and that sitting alone in that dusty place was depressing. She claimed they were actually doing me a massive favor by taking the property off my hands before the maintenance costs bankrupted me. Before I could respond, Philip raised his hand, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. He smiled a sickeningly sweet smile and told me not to worry about a thing. He announced that he had already looked into a budget-friendly assisted living facility on the outskirts of the city. He promised to personally pay the deposit for my first month. He spoke to me slowly, dripping with condescension, stating that it was the absolute least he could do for a man who had failed so completely to provide for his own family. Barbara nodded in agreement, not even looking at me, her eyes fixed firmly on her empty wine glass. They had planned this entire evening. The expensive steaks, the imported wine, the intimidating restaurant. It was a coordinated ambush designed to make me feel small, helpless, and completely dependent on their mercy. They expected me to break down. They expected me to realize my own worthlessness and sign the papers just to remain in their good graces. I reached out and pushed the yellow envelope back across the mahogany table. It slid until it bumped against Matthew's water glass. I looked directly into my son's eyes and told him with absolute calm that I would not be signing the deed to my home. The color rushed into Matthew's face. His jaw clenched tightly. The smooth corporate facade shattered in an instant, revealing the spoiled, entitled child underneath. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware. He leaned in, his voice shaking with genuine rage. He told me that I was a stubborn old fool. He demanded to know what I even needed the house for, asking if I planned to sit in the garage until I died, tinkering with useless batteries that no one would ever buy. Then he delivered the final crushing blow. He pointed a finger at my chest and shouted that I was a complete failure as a father and as a man. He pointed at Philip and screamed that his new stepfather actually had money, actually had power, and actually knew how the real world worked. The dining room fell silent. A few patrons at nearby tables turned to look. I felt the weight of my son's hatred hanging in the air. For decades, I had carried the guilt of not giving him the wealthy lifestyle he craved. I had endured Barbara's constant complaints about my lack of ambition. I had absorbed their disrespect because I believed that family required endless forgiveness. But in that exact moment, looking at Matthew's twisted face, the illusion of family completely evaporated. I did not yell back. I did not defend my honor or explain the countless nights I had stayed awake worrying about his future. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my worn gray suit. My fingers brushed against a heavy, solid gold pen. It was a gift given to me just 6 hours prior by the chief executive officer of a global energy consortium. I had used that exact pen to sign over the exclusive rights to the solid-state energy storage patent I had spent 20 years developing in my garage. The ink was barely dry on a contract that deposited $1.2 billion into my private accounts. I left the pen in my pocket. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a $5 bill and 3 quarters, and placed the exact change for my black coffee on the pristine white tablecloth. I stood up from the table, adjusted my jacket, and turned my back on them without uttering a single word. Matthew yelled after me, demanding that I come back and sign the papers. I kept walking. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse and stepped out into the cool evening air. The city lights blurred as a strange, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I was no longer a victim. I was a man who had just been handed the keys to the world, and I knew exactly how I was going to use them. I reached my 10-year-old sedan in the parking lot and unlocked the door. Just as I slid into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Matthew. The message read that since I wanted to be difficult, they were taking the gloves off. He stated that Philip's lawyers were filing an emergency competency hearing first thing in the morning. He told me that they were going to prove I was mentally unfit to manage my own assets and take the house the hard way. The text ended with a simple command to pack my bags. I read the message twice. My son had officially declared war. I placed the phone in the passenger seat and started the engine. I didn't drive home. I pulled out into the evening traffic and headed straight toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I had a meeting to arrange, and I was going to ensure that when the dust settled, Matthew would realize he had picked a fight with a ghost who owned the bank. I drove through the city as the heavy evening traffic thinned into quiet streets. The bright neon lights of the downtown financial district reflected off the scratched hood of my old sedan. Any other father in my exact position might have been completely paralyzed by a profound heartbreak. Any other man might have pulled over to the side of the dark road and wept bitterly at the terrifying thought of his own son trying to steal his home and lock him away in a sterile psychiatric ward. I felt absolutely none of those things. The cruel betrayal at the restaurant had burned away all my remaining fatherly illusions, leaving behind a cold and precise clarity that I had not felt in decades. Matthew assumed I was rushing home to pack my belongings in a state of absolute terror. He assumed my quiet departure from the dinner table was the final surrender of a defeated, exhausted old man. He was entirely wrong. I steered my car into the underground parking garage of the tallest glass skyscraper in the city center. I parked between two luxury sports cars and walked purposefully into the massive marble lobby. The air inside this building was completely different from the heavy garlic-scented atmosphere of the restaurant. This was the clean, chilled air of absolute, unapologetic corporate power. My footsteps echoed sharply against the stone floor as I approached the private elevator bank, reserved exclusively for the executive levels. I pressed the glowing button for the top floor. The brushed steel doors slid open smoothly, bringing me directly into the pristine reception area of Reed and Associates. The office was a brilliant masterclass in modern psychological intimidation. There were no warm, inviting colors, no comfortable plush couches, and absolutely no soft music playing in the background. The soaring walls were constructed of frosted glass and cold steel. The floors were polished black granite that mirrored the city lights outside. It was a high-altitude fortress designed specifically to protect the immense wealth of the elite and systematically destroy anyone who dared to challenge their clients. A young receptionist wearing a sharp black suit looked up from her perfectly organized minimalist desk. She did not ask for my name or inquire if I had a scheduled appointment. She already knew exactly who I was and the magnitude of my account. She stood up immediately, offering a deep, respectful nod, and escorted me down a long, completely silent hallway. We reached a set of heavy, solid oak doors at the very end of the corridor. She opened them gracefully, stepping aside to let me enter the inner sanctum. Alexander Reed stood quietly by the towering window, looking out over the glowing grid of the city skyline. Alexander was not a man who ever raised his voice to demand attention. He never felt the need to boast about his vacations or his material possessions, like the loud and insecure Philip Montgomery. Alexander was a silent predator wrapped in a custom-tailored suit. He was the kind of elite corporate attorney who routinely dismantled rival companies before breakfast and froze international bank accounts with a single softly spoken phone call. He turned around as I entered the room, his sharp analytical eyes taking in my worn gray suit and my calm demeanor. He did not judge my humble appearance for a second. He was the only person in the entire world who truly understood the massive financial reality of what I had accomplished in my dusty suburban garage. Alexander walked over to his expansive mahogany desk and poured 2 glasses of imported mineral water. He handed me a crystal glass and gestured toward the deep leather chair positioned directly opposite his workspace. He sat down, steepled his fingers together, and asked me simply how the celebratory family dinner had gone. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the cold water and placed the heavy glass onto the polished wood surface. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out my cell phone. I opened the exact text message Matthew had sent me, explicitly threatening the emergency competency hearing and demanding that I pack my bags for an assisted living facility. I slid the phone smoothly across the wide desk. Alexander picked up the device and read the glowing screen in absolute silence. I watched his jaw tighten slightly as he absorbed the sheer audacity of the threat. I explained calmly that my son and my former wife had formed an aggressive legal alliance with Philip. I detailed their highly coordinated ambush at the restaurant Their arrogant demands for the deed to my house and their stated intention to use the medical system to falsely declare me mentally unfit. I spoke for several minutes without showing a single trace of emotion or distress. I did not ask my attorney for pity or sympathy regarding my broken family. I was delivering a factual, tactical report to my leading general. Alexander placed the phone back onto the desk and leaned back in his leather chair. He noted with professional detachment that they were moving incredibly fast. He explained that they were heavily relying on the element of shock and surprise to force a quick, panicked settlement out of me. He looked me in the eye and asked if I wanted him to dispatch a legal team to block the competency hearing in family court the following morning. He assured me confidently that he could have a panel of independent medical evaluators verify my perfect mental health within hours, completely destroying their offensive legal strategy before it even began. I shook my head slowly and firmly. I told Alexander that playing a defensive game was a complete waste of our valuable time. I did not want to merely block their pathetic attack. I wanted to completely eradicate their ability to ever threaten me again. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the heavy cream-colored envelope I had been carrying close to my chest all day. I flipped open the flap and pulled out the finalized corporate acquisition contract. I placed the thick stack of documents squarely onto the center of his desk. The ink from my gold pen was still perfectly fresh on the final signature line. It was the legally binding agreement permanently transferring my new energy patent to the global consortium for exactly $1.2 billion. Alexander looked down at the signed contract, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. He recognized that the balance of power had just shifted monumentally. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees, and delivered my precise instructions. I ordered him to immediately initiate a full, merciless forensic financial audit of both Philip Montgomery and my son Matthew. I instructed him to deploy his best investigators to uncover every single hidden detail of Philip U.S. supposedly massive commercial real estate empire. I wanted a complete, unredacted breakdown of his leveraged assets, his high-interest private debts, and his vulnerable credit lines. I also demanded the exact financial records of Matthew U.S. failing technology startup, including the specific names of every single venture capital firm currently keeping his worthless company afloat. I told Alexander that by the time the sun came up tomorrow, I wanted to quietly own the private debt holding Philip's luxurious life together. I wanted to become the primary uncompromising creditor for my son's entire business operation. They wanted to steal my modest suburban house and throw me into a budget retirement facility. Therefore, I was going to use my new wealth to quietly buy the very ground they walked on. I promised that when they were absolutely certain they had won the war, I was going to pull their entire reality right out from under their feet. Alexander picked up his secure telephone, his eyes shining brightly with the thrill of the hunt, and began making the late-night calls that would bring their arrogant world crashing down. It was just past 7 in the morning when I walked back into the silent glass and steel lobby of the corporate law firm. I had spent the night in a quiet hotel across town, sleeping soundly for the first time in months. The agonizing weight of trying to please my ungrateful family was entirely gone, replaced by a cold and sharp purpose. Alexander was already waiting for me in the main boardroom. The long mahogany table was completely covered in thick stacks of printed financial records, highlighted bank statements, and complex corporate flowcharts. He looked up from a heavy leather-bound ledger with a predatory gleam in his dark eyes. He told me that his team of elite forensic accountants had worked tirelessly through the entire night. He promised me that what they had uncovered was far worse than we could have ever imagined. Alexander slid the first heavy folder across the polished wood table. It was labeled with Philip Montgomery, U.S. name. Alexander explained meticulously that my ex-wife, U.S. new husband, was not a titan of commercial real estate. He was a desperate fraud balancing blindly on the absolute edge of total financial ruin. Philip had built his entire arrogant public image on an incredibly dangerous foundation of toxic and high-interest debt. He technically owned several massive commercial properties, but they were leveraged to the absolute limit. He had taken out predatory loans from aggressive private lenders just to cover the massive monthly interest payments on his older loans. The luxurious European vacations, the custom-tailored Italian suits, and the expensive imported wine at the steakhouse were all paid for with money he did not actually possess. Alexander pointed a silver pen to a specific highlighted column on the final page of the audit. Philip's primary creditors were demanding an immediate repayment of $5 million by the end of the month. If he missed that specific payment, his entire real estate portfolio would be seized and legally liquidated. That was the exact reason they needed my small suburban house. It had absolutely nothing to do with finding me a comfortable, budget-friendly retirement community. Philip was actively trying to steal my only remaining asset so he could use the clean and unencumbered deed as hard collateral for a desperate bridge loan. He needed my home to keep his sinking ship afloat for just a few more weeks. Barbara had abandoned a loyal husband to worship a false idol made entirely of stolen money and empty promises. The revelation about Philip was deeply satisfying, but the second folder Alexander opened hit much closer to home. It contained the complete internal audit of my son's U.S. technology startup. Matthew had spent the last 2 years boasting loudly about his rapid corporate expansion and his supposedly brilliant software innovations. The cold, hard numbers on the printed page told a completely different story. The startup was a hollow and rotting shell. They had not secured a single profitable contract in over 18 months. The entire business operation was burning through investor cash at an unsustainable rate, paying for lavish downtown office spaces and extravagant corporate retreats that produced absolutely no value. The only thing currently keeping the company alive was a single venture capital firm that owned 90% of Matthew's U.S. corporate debt. Alexander smiled grimly and tapped the paper with his knuckle. He revealed that the venture capital firm was bleeding money because of my son and was actively looking to sell that debt at a massive discount just to get the toxic asset completely off their books. Matthew was entirely dependent on Philip for a massive financial bailout. My son was completely unaware that his wealthy and powerful stepfather was secretly far more bankrupt than he was. They were two drowning men violently dragging each other down to the bottom of the ocean. I listened to every single word in absolute silence. My son and my former wife had happily thrown me away. They had publicly humiliated me and called me a miserable failure while they were secretly drowning in their own pathetic incompetence. I reached for my black coffee and looked out the towering glass windows at the morning sun reflecting off the city skyline. I told Alexander that it was time to actively weaponize this highly sensitive information. I did not want to simply expose them. I wanted to own them. I instructed my attorney to immediately establish a private and completely anonymous holding company. I named the shadow corporation Apex Dynamics. I wanted this new entity to be an impenetrable financial fortress. I authorized the immediate transfer of $50 million from my new billion-dollar energy patent fortune directly into the hidden accounts of Apex Dynamics. My specific orders were simple, calculated, and absolutely merciless. Alexander was to use the immense capital of the shadow company to silently purchase every single high-interest loan that Philip owed to the aggressive private lenders. Simultaneously, his team was to buy out the frustrated venture capital firm holding my son's U.S. massive corporate debt. I made it perfectly clear that I did not want my real name to appear on a single legal document. I wanted them to wake up tomorrow morning, owing their entire miserable existence to a faceless and terrifying corporate entity. I wanted to become the invisible puppet master controlling every single aspect of their financial survival. Alexander nodded slowly, a look of profound professional respect washing over his face. He began typing rapidly into his secure encrypted terminal, officially executing the massive transfer of funds. By the end of the business day, Apex Dynamics would legally own the roof over Philip U.S. head, the expensive cars in his driveway, and the very desk where my son sat. The trap was set perfectly in the shadows, and now all I had to do was wait for them to walk blindly right into the steel jaws. I sat perfectly still in the deep leather chair and watched Alexander work. He did not make dramatic phone calls or shout across a busy trading floor. Modern financial warfare is conducted in absolute silence. His fingers moved gracefully across the illuminated keyboard of his encrypted terminal. He was navigating the dark waters of private equity, contacting the ruthless lenders who held Philip Montgomery by the throat. Within 45 minutes, Alexander had located the primary holding company that controlled the high-interest loans threatening to destroy my former wife's new husband. The private lenders were incredibly eager to offload the toxic debt. They had assumed Philip was going to default by the end of the month anyway, leaving them to deal with a messy and expensive foreclosure process. When my newly formed shadow corporation, Apex Dynamics, offered to purchase the entire real estate debt portfolio for cold hard cash, the transaction was approved almost instantaneously. I watched the digital progress bar on Alexander's massive wall monitor fill with a bright green light. In less than an hour, the $5 million of predatory debt that was keeping Philip awake at night legally transferred into my absolute control. Alexander immediately pivoted his attention to the venture capital firm backing my ungrateful son. This transaction required a slightly more delicate touch. The investment firm was furious with Matthew for burning through their initial seed money on useless corporate retreats and expensive downtown office leases. My son had produced absolutely no viable software or marketable products. Alexander drafted a blind acquisition offer on behalf of Apex Dynamics. He offered to buy Matthew's entire corporate debt at a calculated discount. The venture capital executives did not ask a single question about who was behind the mysterious shadow corporation. They were simply desperate to cut their massive losses and remove the embarrassment of Matthew's failing company from their quarterly reports. The digital contracts were sent signed and countersigned through secure servers before the morning coffee in the boardroom had even turned cold. Alexander printed the final confirmation receipts and slid the heavy stack of warm paper across the mahogany desk. I rested my hand on the documents. The physical weight of those pages was profound. My son and his wealthy new stepfather were currently waking up in their luxurious homes, entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in their reality. They were likely sipping imported espresso right now, laughing with my former wife about the pathetic old man they had humiliated at the Wellington Steakhouse the night before. They believed they held all the cards because they were vicious, loud, and cruel. They completely failed to understand that true power does not need to shout. True power operates quietly in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I had not laid a single finger on either of them. I had not raised my voice or threatened them with physical violence. Instead, I had systematically purchased the very air they breathed. I was now the sole proprietor of their financial survival. If I snapped my fingers, Philip would lose his sprawling estate and his collection of expensive imported cars. If I gave the word, Matthew would be locked out of his own corporate headquarters before his lunch break. I was their absolute master, and the most beautiful part of this entire flawless execution was that they had absolutely no idea I even existed in this realm of wealth. I thanked Alexander for his precision and left the towering glass skyscraper. I drove my old sedan out of the bustling financial district and headed back toward the quiet suburban neighborhood I had called home for 40 years. The morning sun was shining brightly, casting long, familiar shadows across the manicured lawns and concrete driveways. I pulled into my property and parked next to my detached garage. The small 3-bedroom house looked exactly the same as it had when I left it yesterday, but I viewed it entirely differently now. It was no longer a symbol of my financial struggle or my sacrifices as a father. It was the perfect bait. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet living room. I walked into the kitchen, filled the old steel kettle with water, and placed it on the stove. I prepared a simple cup of black coffee and sat at the small wooden dining table. I did not bother to unpack my bags or organize the stack of mail sitting on the counter. I simply sat in the silence, savoring the profound peace that comes with absolute control and knowing exactly how the game would end. The quiet morning was suddenly shattered by a violent pounding on the solid wood of my front door. The heavy blows rattled the glass panes in the surrounding windows. I placed my ceramic coffee mug gently onto the table and stood up. The pounding continued, accompanied by the loud rumbling noise of a massive diesel engine out in the street. I walked slowly through the living room and turned the brass lock. I pulled the heavy door open to find my son standing on my front porch. Matthew was breathing heavily, his face twisted into an ugly mask of arrogant triumph. He was clutching a thick stack of legal documents stamped with the bright red seal of the local family court. Behind him, idling loudly at the edge of my front lawn, was a massive commercial moving truck. 4 large men in matching gray uniforms were already unlatching the heavy metal ramp at the back of the vehicle. Matthew stepped forward and shoved the thick stack of court documents directly into my chest. He smiled a cruel, heartless smile and announced loudly that the judge had signed the emergency eviction order. He told me that my time was officially up, the house belonged to him now, and he ordered me to get off his property immediately. Matthew stood on my front porch like a conquering general. He held the court order inches from my face, expecting me to scream or beg or collapse onto the welcome mat in a fit of hysterical tears. I looked at the bright red stamp of the family court, and then looked directly into my son's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse him or his new wealthy stepfather. I simply stepped back and opened the heavy wooden door wider, inviting him inside. I told him calmly that there was no need to cause a massive scene for the neighbors to gossip about. Matthew blinked in absolute confusion. He had prepared his mind for a violent screaming match. He had desperately wanted a dramatic and physical fight, so he could feel completely justified in his incredible cruelty. My absolute stoic calm completely unnerved him. He signaled the 4 large moving men to wait by the commercial truck and stepped cautiously into the living room. Samantha followed closely behind him, holding a silver measuring tape and a thick leather-bound notebook. She did not even look at my face. She immediately began inspecting the classic crown molding and complaining loudly about the faded paint on the living room walls. I watched my son and his wife stand in the center of the home I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. They were completely devoid of any shame or hesitation or basic human decency. I turned away from their arrogant faces and walked slowly down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. I had lived in this house for 40 years. Every single scratch on the hardwood floors and every dark oil stain on the garage concrete told the long story of my life. I had raised my son within these exact walls. I had stayed up countless nights pacing this specific hallway while he suffered through terrible childhood fevers. I had carried his mother across the threshold when we were young and full of foolish hope. Now I was being legally erased from the premises by the very boy I had sacrificed everything to protect. I did not pull out massive cardboard boxes or heavy plastic suitcases. I opened my closet door and reached up to the top shelf for a single brown leather briefcase. It was the exact same briefcase I had carried to the engineering plant every single morning before my quiet retirement. I opened the heavy brass clasps and placed exactly 3 items inside. I packed my leather shaving kit, a clean change of conservative clothes, and a small silver-framed photograph of my late parents. I deliberately left everything else behind. I left the beautiful antique furniture I had painstakingly restored by hand. I left my extensive collection of rare engineering textbooks. I left 4 decades of warm memories sitting quietly in the gathering dust. I knew deeply in my heart that I did not need to pack my physical belongings because I was not actually losing my home. I was simply lending the physical structure to a foolish thief for a few short days. I closed the brass clasps of the briefcase with a sharp metallic click. When I walked back into the living room, Samantha was already loudly directing the moving crew. She was pointing a sharp, manicured finger at my favorite reading chair and instructing the large men to throw it directly into the rusted dumpster out in the back alley. She claimed to her husband that the old furniture smelled heavily of old people and miserable failure. She stated that they needed to clear out all the garbage before they could hire a premium interior designer to make the space actually livable. I walked right past her complaining voice and stepped out onto the front lawn. The warm morning sun hit my face, offering a brief moment of comfort. A yellow taxicab I had ordered 30 minutes earlier was already idling softly at the edge of the concrete driveway. Matthew followed me outside, his chest puffed out with incredible, unearned pride. He stopped on the green grass and crossed his arms over his expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit. He told me loudly, so the moving men could clearly hear his authority, that this was exactly what happened when stubborn people refused to adapt to the real corporate world. He claimed with a straight face that he was simply doing what was absolutely necessary to protect his own financial future from my incompetence. Samantha walked out of the front door and linked her arm tightly through his. She smiled a sickeningly sweet and venomous smile. She told me loudly to enjoy the budget retirement facility and suggested I make some new friends who shared my pathetic lack of ambition. She promised mockingly to send me a glossy postcard from their upcoming luxury vacation to the Bahamas. They were completely intoxicated by their perceived total victory. They stood proudly on my front lawn, breathing the fresh suburban air, deeply believing they were absolute royalty who had just successfully executed a brilliant and flawless hostile takeover of my life. I stopped at the open rear door of the yellow taxi. I reached into the deep pocket of my trousers and pulled out the heavy brass key ring holding the master keys to the property. I held the metal ring up in the bright sunlight so it caught the glare. Matthew took a step forward and reached out his hand eagerly to take his final glorious prize. I did not hand the keys to him. I dropped them directly onto the hard concrete driveway. The metal keys landed with a sharp clatter right next to his expensive, polished leather shoes. I did not say a single parting word to either of them. I simply turned my back, opened the door of the taxi, and slid into the worn vinyl seat. I closed the door firmly, shutting out the sound of their arrogant laughter and their cruel taunts. I gave the driver the address to a premier luxury hotel located in the very heart of the downtown financial district. As the taxi pulled slowly away from the curb, I looked out the rear window. I watched my son bend down to pick up the keys and hold them triumphantly in the air like a magnificent trophy. I watched Samantha kiss his cheek in grand celebration. They were actively celebrating the petty theft of a small suburban house, while remaining entirely ignorant to the massive, terrifying fact that my invisible shadow corporation now legally owned the very air they breathed. They truly thought they had evicted an old, helpless man from his simple life. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked willingly and joyfully into a cold steel cage built entirely out of their own boundless greed. I sat back in the quiet taxi, feeling completely at peace with the universe. The first painful phase of my grand plan was officially complete. It was now time for their luxurious and fake reality to crumble into absolute dust. 2 days passed in absolute silence. I remained in my luxury suite at the downtown hotel, watching the city move far below my window, while my enemies prepared for their grand celebration. Philip Montgomery was hosting an extravagant charity gala at his sprawling country estate. It was billed publicly as a philanthropic event to raise money for local arts programs, but Alexander and I knew its true purpose. It was a desperate and incredibly expensive illusion, designed specifically to attract wealthy new investors to save Philip U.S. sinking real estate empire. The Montgomery estate was a massive stone mansion sitting on 20 acres of perfectly manicured land. That evening, the long circular driveway was completely jammed with imported luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white uniforms sprinted back and forth, opening the doors of sleek black town cars and expensive sports cars. A string quartet played classical music on the grand stone terrace, with the delicate notes floating over the massive swimming pool that glowed with a bright artificial blue light. Waiters carried heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and incredibly expensive caviar. Every single detail of the evening was meticulously crafted to project an aura of absolute unshakable wealth. Philip stood at the very center of the grand ballroom, holding a heavy glass of amber whiskey. He wore a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket and laughed loudly at jokes made by the local bank executives. He clapped men on the shoulder and spun elaborate tales about his upcoming commercial developments. He spoke of millions of dollars as if they were loose change he had found in his pocket. He desperately needed these powerful men to believe he was invincible, so they would write the massive checks required to cover the toxic debt he thought he still owed to his aggressive private lenders. He had absolutely no idea that those private lenders had already sold his financial soul to my shadow corporation. Barbara stood right beside him, completely transformed by the illusion of unlimited money. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the brilliant light of the massive crystal chandeliers hanging above them. She smiled gracefully at the wives of the potential investors, speaking softly about her extensive charity work and her refined tastes in modern art. She had completely erased the memory of our modest life together. She had convinced herself that she was born to royalty and that her years spent with a quiet, hard-working mechanical engineer were just a tragic mistake she had finally managed to correct. Matthew and Samantha arrived at the gala walking arm in arm, radiating a sickening level of pride. They had spent the last 48 hours tearing apart my suburban house, throwing my personal history into a rented dumpster. Now they were dressed in high fashion, eager to show the elite crowd that they truly belonged in this exclusive circle of extreme wealth. Matthew held a glass of champagne and spoke loudly to a group of young technology investors. He boasted endlessly about his software startup, claiming they were on the verge of a massive global expansion and a lucrative public offering. He conveniently failed to mention that his company had not produced a single working product in 2 years and was surviving entirely on borrowed money. Samantha was even worse. She gathered a group of wealthy women near a towering ice sculpture and complained loudly about the exhausting process of renovating a newly acquired property. She laughed cruelly as she described the pathetic, outdated furniture they had thrown into the trash. She told them how they had finally forced a stubborn, difficult relative out of the house for his own good. She framed their absolute theft of my home as an act of noble charity. She bathed in the sympathetic nods of the other women, enjoying the absolute thrill of playing the graceful victim while actively destroying her father-in-law U.S. life. From the outside, they looked like the perfect, powerful family. They were surrounded by exquisite beauty, expensive food, and powerful allies. But the entire evening was built directly on a massive invisible fault line. The velvet jacket Philip wore was paid for by a credit card carrying a staggering interest rate. The diamond necklace around Barbara U.S. neck was leased from a jeweler who was already threatening to repossess it. The very stone floor they were standing on and the roof over their heads were now legally owned entirely by Apex Dynamics. They were nothing more than ghosts haunting a beautiful castle they did not actually possess. They truly believed they had reached the absolute peak of society. They thought they had successfully discarded the weak old man and permanently secured their golden future. Every single smile they flashed, every arrogant boast they made, and every sip of expensive wine they swallowed was a profound testament to their own ignorance. They were actively celebrating their great victory while standing directly on the trapdoor I had carefully built beneath their feet. They felt untouchable because they were completely blind to the reality thoughts of the corporate world they claimed to understand so well. The classical music played on the champagne flowed endlessly, and the night grew darker outside the tall glass windows. The grand stage was now perfectly set. Their false peak had been reached, and the devastating fall was only a few hours away. Alexander sat in his quiet glass office watching the digital clock on his monitor change to exactly 9 in the evening. This was the precise moment we had chosen to drop the heavy blade. At that exact second, across the city, Philip Montgomery was standing on the grand marble staircase of his rented country estate. He was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne high in the air, preparing to deliver his keynote toast to the wealthy investors gathered in his massive ballroom. He smiled his brightest artificial smile and began speaking about the limitless future of his commercial real estate empire. He was entirely blind to the digital execution that was happening in the deep shadows. Alexander pressed a single key on his encrypted terminal. In a fraction of a second, massive financial firewalls slammed shut across the country. The trap was officially sprung. Before Philip could even finish his arrogant speech, his private cell phone began to vibrate violently in his velvet jacket pocket. He ignored it, preferring to bask in the warm applause of his wealthy guests. Then the chief financial officer standing near the ice sculpture felt his own phone ring. Then the manager of the elite catering company running the event received an urgent automated text message. The massive payment required to keep the waiters pouring wine and the musicians playing music had just been aggressively declined by the corporate bank. The catering manager immediately signaled his staff to stop serving the expensive caviar and to quietly begin packing up their equipment. A sudden and incredibly awkward silence began to spread through the lavish ballroom, like a cold winter wind. The investors noticed the sudden lack of music and the nervous whispering among the service staff. Philip stepped down from the marble staircase, feeling the abrupt shift in the atmosphere. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and stared at the glowing screen in absolute horror. He had 17 missed calls and a flood of urgent text messages from his primary private lenders. The messages did not ask for a simple meeting or a polite extension on his monthly payments. They were formal legal notifications that his massive predatory loans had been aggressively purchased by a new corporate entity named Apex Dynamics. The notifications stated clearly that all of his debt was being immediately called in due to multiple hidden breach of contract clauses that Philip had foolishly ignored for years. Apex Dynamics was demanding full and total repayment of $5 million by midnight, or they would instantly seize his sprawling estate and all of his remaining liquid assets. The color drained completely from the face of Philip. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a tall cliff and was suspended in the air, waiting for gravity to pull him down. He desperately tried to log into his corporate banking applications to move emergency funds around, but the screens flashed bright red. His premium credit cards were instantly frozen. His hidden business accounts were completely locked. He was entirely paralyzed. Barbara walked up to him smiling gracefully and asked why the musicians had suddenly stopped playing their beautiful music. Philip could not even form the words to answer her. He simply stared at his frozen bank accounts, realizing that he was no longer a wealthy king, but a terrified prisoner facing total financial ruin. The financial contagion spread rapidly across the crowded ballroom. Matthew was standing by the grand glass windows, boasting to a group of young technology investors about his upcoming luxury vacation to the Bahamas. His phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. He checked the screen, expecting a congratulatory message from a colleague. Instead, he saw a devastating alert from his primary venture capital firm. The firm notified him that his entire corporate debt had been sold to Apex Dynamics and that all of his operational funding was immediately suspended, pending a massive forensic fraud audit. Matthew excused himself from the wealthy group, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He frantically tried to call his business partners, but every single number he dialed went straight to a generic corporate voicemail. Samantha was standing at the private bar, demanding another glass of vintage champagne. She was abruptly told by the bartender that her exclusive credit card had been firmly declined. She argued loudly, causing a massive embarrassing scene, but the portable card machine continued to blink red. The other wealthy women in the room began to point and whisper. The absolute illusion of their superiority was violently shattered in front of the most powerful people in the entire city. They were exposed as absolute frauds. Philip grabbed Matthew by the arm and dragged him roughly into a dark, private study, slamming the heavy oak doors shut to escape the confused whispers of their guests. Philip was sweating profusely, his expensive velvet jacket completely ruined by his pure terror. He paced the hardwood floor like a trapped animal. He turned to my son and demanded an immediate solution to their nightmare. Philip stated that they needed cash right now, or they were both going to federal prison for extreme financial fraud. He looked Matthew directly in the eyes and ordered him to illegally leverage the suburban house they had just stolen from me. Philip commanded his stepson to contact a predatory overnight lender and use the clean property deed as hard collateral for a massive emergency bridge loan. It was a highly illegal maneuver, but it was the absolute only way to appease the faceless monster known as Apex Dynamics. Matthew nodded, desperately eager to prove his worth and save his own sinking company. He pulled out his laptop and immediately logged into the county property registry portal. He intended to download the official transfer documents to prove he owned my home so he could secure the illegal loan. His fingers flew across the keyboard as Philip stood over his shoulder, breathing heavily. The digital registry loaded slowly, line by line. Matthew scrolled down to my property address, expecting to see his own holding company listed as the sole proprietor. He stopped breathing. The screen did not show his name. The legal registry showed that less than an hour ago, the entire property title had been completely and irrevocably transferred to a massive corporate trust. Matthew stared at the glowing white letters on the screen, completely unable to comprehend the absolute reality of what he was seeing. He turned his laptop around slowly so his terrified stepfather could see the screen. The small suburban house they had sacrificed their entire family to steal was legally owned by the exact same terrifying corporation that was currently destroying their lives. The screen clearly displayed the name Apex Dynamics. They were completely checkmated and trapped in a burning room with absolutely no exits. I sat in the secure control room, located just behind the main executive boardroom. Alexander stood beside me with his arms crossed over his chest. We were staring intently at a wall of high-definition security monitors. It was 8 in the morning on the day after their disastrous charity gala. The bright morning sun illuminated the towering glass and steel architecture of the financial district, but the two men walking toward our front entrance looked as though they had not seen the sun in years. I watched my son Matthew and his wealthy stepfather, Philip Montgomery, push through the heavy revolving doors of the ground floor lobby. They had begged our corporate secretaries for an emergency meeting at dawn. They were entirely desperate to negotiate a settlement with the unknown chief executive officer of Apex Dynamics. They had spent the entire night running from the massive legal avalanche we had triggered. The high-resolution cameras captured every single pathetic detail of their physical deterioration. The arrogant swagger they had displayed on my front lawn just 2 days ago was completely gone. Philip was wearing the exact same custom-tailored suit he had worn to the gala the previous night. The expensive fabric was deeply wrinkled and stained with spilled alcohol. His face was pale and covered in a thick layer of nervous sweat. He carried a leather briefcase, but his hands were shaking so violently that the metal buckles rattled against each other. He looked like an incredibly old and fragile man who had suddenly realized that his entire life was a meaningless illusion. Matthew looked even worse. My son walked a few steps behind Philip with his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting frantically around the massive marble lobby. His designer shirt was untucked, and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck. The security footage clearly showed the dark purple bags under his eyes. I knew exactly why they looked so utterly destroyed. They were not simply facing bankruptcy. They were facing immediate federal prison sentences. When Matthew had foolishly attempted to secure an emergency overnight loan using the stolen deed to my suburban house, he had committed severe financial fraud. When he submitted those documents to the lending agency, he had created a permanent digital paper trail of his desperate crime. Apex Dynamics had immediately flagged the fraudulent transaction and forwarded the evidence to the federal authorities. We had graciously offered to pause the criminal indictment for exactly 1 hour so they could attend this emergency meeting. We had placed a loaded gun to their heads and demanded they walk willingly into our fortress. I watched the two terrified men approach the minimalist front reception desk. The lobby of our building was intentionally designed to make visitors feel incredibly small and insignificant. The ceiling was 40 feet high and constructed of cold gray concrete. The floor was polished black granite that reflected their ruined appearances back at them. Philip leaned heavily against the desk to support his own weight. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with a crumpled silk handkerchief. He spoke to the receptionist with a weak and trembling voice. He pleaded for the opportunity to speak with the president of the holding company. He promised frantically that he could liquidate his remaining assets and find a way to repay the massive $5 million debt if they were just given a few more weeks to breathe. The young receptionist did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. She had been strictly instructed by Alexander to treat them with absolute professional coldness. She did not smile, and she did not offer them a glass of water. She simply pressed a single button on her desk and told them to proceed directly to the private executive elevator. I watched Philip swallow hard. He turned to my son and whispered something in his ear. Matthew nodded slowly, but he looked completely hollow. The two men walked toward the stainless steel elevator doors like condemned prisoners walking slowly toward the gallows. When the heavy metal doors slid shut, the camera inside the elevator cabin switched on. I had a perfect view of their private terror as the machine lifted them 50 stories into the air. They did not speak a single word to each other during the long ride. The silence between them was suffocating. Philip stared blankly at the glowing numbers above the door, while his chest heaved with panic. Matthew stared down at his expensive leather shoes. I knew my son was replaying every single terrible decision he had made over the last week. He had traded a loyal father for a fraudulent stepfather who had completely destroyed his life. They had tried to play a vicious game of corporate warfare against an old man they considered weak. Now they were trapped in a metal box flying directly toward the jaws of a massive corporate beast they could not even comprehend. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors slid open to reveal the top floor. The executive level was completely silent. The long hallway was lined with dark mahogany wood and frosted glass panels. There were no busy secretaries or junior associates walking the floors. It was a space reserved entirely for the absolute highest level of financial execution. Philip stepped out of the elevator first, dragging his feet across the thick carpet. Matthew followed him, completely stripped of the miserable arrogance that had defined his entire adult life. They were beggars now. They had come to grovel and plead for their freedom from a faceless billionaire who held their complete destruction in the palm of his hand. Alexander placed his hand on the brass handle of the control room door. He looked at me and gave a short, affirming nod. The prey had finally arrived at the slaughterhouse. I took a deep, steadying breath and adjusted the cuffs of my clean gray suit. I felt absolutely no pity for the two men walking slowly down the hall. They had actively chosen this dark path when they sat at the steakhouse and decided my life was worthless. I stepped out of the hidden control room and walked into the massive main boardroom. I walked past the long wooden table and sat down in the large leather chair positioned at the very head of the room. I turned the chair around so it faced the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I sat in the absolute silence, waiting for the heavy wooden doors behind me to open. The heavy oak doors swung open with a soft metallic click. I heard the hesitant shuffling of expensive leather shoes against the thick carpet. Philip cleared his throat, creating a dry and nervous sound that echoed in the cavernous space. I kept my chair turned completely toward the expansive glass windows, gazing out at the morning sun reflecting off the city buildings. Alexander stood silently in the corner of the room, holding a thick leather folder. Philip began to speak to the back of my chair. His voice was trembling violently. He introduced himself as the president of his real estate group, desperately trying to project a sense of authority that had completely evaporated overnight. He thanked the invisible chief executive officer for granting this emergency meeting at such an early hour. He launched into a pathetic, frantic explanation of his temporary liquidity issues. He promised that his portfolio was incredibly strong and begged for a 30-day extension on the massive loans Apex Dynamics had just aggressively acquired. He practically choked on his own words, his desperation filling the quiet room like thick, black smoke. He pleaded that he had a family to support and a massive charity network that depended on his success. He was completely willing to say anything to save his own skin. Then my son spoke. Matthew took a step forward and added his own miserable plea. He stated that his technology startup was on the verge of a massive global breakthrough. He begged the faceless corporation to release the operational funding that had been frozen the night before. He promised to sign over 30% of his company equity if we would just give him a chance to prove his worth. He blamed his previous venture capital investors for his current financial failures, claiming they had mismanaged his brilliant ideas. They were offering me the very things I already legally owned, begging for mercy from a phantom they could not see. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for 10 agonizing seconds. The quiet was absolute. Then I placed my hands firmly on the leather armrests and slowly pushed my foot against the floor. The heavy executive chair rotated smoothly on its axis. I turned around completely to face the center of the long mahogany table. I looked directly at the two men standing near the doorway. The moment my face came into their full view, the physical reaction was immediate and profound. Philip stopped breathing entirely. His mouth fell open, his jaw hanging loose as if the muscles had completely snapped. His eyes widened to an impossible degree, completely devoid of comprehension. He blinked rapidly, desperately, trying to clear what he must have assumed was a terrifying stress-induced hallucination. He looked at Alexander standing in the corner, then back to me sitting calmly in the seat of absolute corporate power. The expensive leather briefcase slipped from his sweaty fingers and crashed loudly onto the polished granite floor. The loud, sharp noise did not even make him flinch. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment. He tried to take a breath, but his chest simply hitched in a silent panic. The wealthy, arrogant man who had offered to put me in a budget retirement facility was currently staring at his absolute destruction. Matthew looked significantly worse. All the color instantly vanished from my son's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward until his back hit the heavy oak door. He stared at my clean, practical suit and the gold pen resting in my breast pocket. His eyes darted wildly around the massive boardroom, trying to find a hidden camera or a logical explanation for this waking nightmare. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat worked silently up and down. The arrogant young man who had loudly declared me a miserable failure at the restaurant was now completely stripped of his voice. He realized in that exact agonizing second that he had not just insulted his father. He had deeply insulted the billionaire who literally owned his entire existence. His knees began to physically shake, causing his expensive trousers to vibrate against his legs. I folded my hands on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward slightly. I did not yell. I kept my voice perfectly calm and measured, matching the exact tone I had used when I refused to sign away my house. I thanked Philip for his incredibly generous offer of company equity. I noted that it was a remarkably bold strategy to offer me a percentage of a company that I already owned in its absolute entirety. I watched the final remaining shred of hope completely die in Philip's eyes. He collapsed heavily into one of the guest chairs, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, suffocating whimper. The realization that he had willingly handed the keys to his empire over to the man he had ruthlessly mocked finally crushed his spirit. I then turned my gaze entirely to my son. Matthew was still pressed against the door, shaking visibly. I reminded him of the cruel words he had shouted at me just 3 nights ago. I repeated his exact sentence perfectly. I said that he had called me a complete failure because his new stepfather actually had money. I gestured around the towering glass boardroom and down to the thick stack of legal documents resting on the table. I told him that I found his financial assessment incredibly fascinating, considering I had just purchased his wealthy stepfather's entire empire with the pocket change from my new billion-dollar patent acquisition. I told him that Apex Dynamics was not a faceless corporation. Apex Dynamics was the loyal father he had happily thrown away. I informed them both that they were completely bankrupt and facing federal prison for attempting to illegally leverage a property I already owned. The absolute silence that followed my words was the most beautiful and satisfying sound I had ever heard. I did not say another word. I simply reached across the polished mahogany table and pulled the thick leather folder from Alexander. I opened the heavy cover and began to lay out the official legal documents one by one in a neat row. I slid the first document toward Philip. It was the absolute and irrevocable transfer of his $5 million predatory debt directly to Apex Dynamics. I placed the second document next to it. It was the clean deed to the sprawling country estate where they had hosted their lavish charity gala just hours ago. I then placed the title to his luxury sports car and the completely frozen banking statements of his commercial real estate empire right in front of his trembling hands. I turned my attention away from the ruined man and looked at my son. I slid the finalized venture capital acquisition contract smoothly across the polished wood. I pointed to the bold black ink at the very bottom of the page. I explained calmly that I now officially owned 90% of his technology startup. I owned the expensive downtown office lease he constantly bragged about. I owned the very servers that held his completely worthless software. I told them both that they did not have a single dollar to their names that did not belong entirely to me. The sheer physical weight of the printed evidence completely broke them. Philip stared down at the paperwork with vacant, hollow eyes. He was a completely broken man who had finally reached the absolute end of his fraudulent road. But Matthew reacted entirely differently. The intense panic in his wide eyes suddenly shifted into a cold, calculating desperation. My son realized in that exact moment that his wealthy stepfather was completely useless to him now. Matthew possessed the exact same toxic survival instinct as his mother. He looked at the devastating documents resting on the table and then turned his head slowly to look at Philip. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, vicious disgust. Matthew took a deep breath and immediately threw the man he had worshipped right under the moving train. Matthew pointed a shaking finger directly at the chest of Philip. My son raised his voice so it echoed loudly off the thick glass walls of the massive boardroom. He told me that none of this horrible situation was his idea. He claimed frantically that Philip had masterminded the entire evil plot to steal the suburban house. Matthew swore to me that his stepfather had pressured him and aggressively manipulated him into presenting those eviction documents at the family dinner table. He painted himself as an innocent victim who was simply trying to survive under the tyrannical rule of a corrupt real estate mogul. Philip snapped abruptly out of his silent shock. His face flushed with a sudden violent red anger. Philip stood up from the leather guest chair and screamed at Matthew, calling him a pathetic, cowardly liar. He shouted that Matthew had been the one begging for money for months. He reminded my son that he had happily driven the commercial moving truck to my house and laughed while throwing my personal belongings into the rusted dumpster. The two men stood in the center of the pristine corporate boardroom, viciously tearing each other to pieces. They cursed each other loudly. They revealed every single dark secret and petty theft they had committed together over the last few years. They behaved exactly like two starving rats trapped inside a rapidly sinking ship. I sat back in my large executive chair and watched them completely destroy their own false family. I felt absolutely no sadness for them. I felt no fatherly desire to intervene and stop the heavy bleeding. I simply let them expose their true rotten natures to the bright morning light flooding through the windows. They had spent years mocking my quiet life and my deep dedication to hard work. Now they were weeping and screaming over the ashes of their stolen wealth. I let them fight until they were completely out of breath. Their chests heave heavily, and their expensive tailored suits were completely soaked with nervous sweat. I raised my hand slowly, signaling for absolute silence. The massive room instantly fell quiet. I looked directly into the desperate eyes of Matthew. I told him that I found his sudden loyalty to his biological father incredibly convenient, but unfortunately completely unbelievable. However, I was willing to offer him exactly one final opportunity to prove his worth as a man. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. I proposed a simple but incredibly dangerous arrangement. I offered to completely wipe away the massive financial debt of his technology startup. I offered to let him walk out of this corporate building as a free man without facing a single federal fraud charge for the illegal loan documents. But the price for his absolute freedom was exceptionally heavy. He had to permanently resign as the chief executive officer of his own company. He had to formally surrender his luxury vehicles and his expensive downtown apartment. Most importantly, he had to accept a standard entry-level desk job at my new philanthropic foundation for exactly 1 year. He would work 40 hours a week sorting mail and filing basic paperwork for standard minimum wage. I told him that if he could swallow his massive arrogant pride and work an honest job for 1 full year, I would generously release his company back to his control. Matthew stared at me, his eyes wide with a strange mixture of absolute relief and deep, greedy calculation. He thought I was simply acting like a strict old father trying to teach a rebellious son a harsh lesson about the value of $1. He genuinely thought he had successfully manipulated my emotions with his pathetic display of loyalty. He fell to his knees on the polished granite floor and cried fake tears of gratitude. He thanked me profusely and swore to the heavens that he would become the best, hardest-working employee my foundation had ever seen. I nodded slowly and told him to report to his new cubicle on Monday morning. I watched him scramble to his feet and leave the boardroom feeling a deep, cold satisfaction. I knew my son was completely incapable of doing honest work. I had just built the perfect trap, and Matthew was eagerly marching right into the center of it. I sat alone in the massive executive boardroom long after my son had practically crawled out the door. The absolute silence of the glass tower was a sharp contrast to the pathetic screaming match I had just witnessed. Matthew truly believed he had survived the executioner block by crying a few fake tears and throwing his wealthy stepfather to the wolves. He thought he had successfully manipulated his old father into showing mercy. I picked up the signed contract granting me total control of his hollow technology company and locked it safely inside my leather briefcase. I knew with absolute certainty that a man who could so easily betray his own blood for a luxurious lifestyle did not possess the capacity for genuine redemption. Greed is not a temporary mistake. It is a chronic rotting disease that infects the very core of a person. I had not offered him a desk job because I wanted to save his soul. I had offered him a mundane entry-level position because I needed to build a perfect invisible cage where his true dark nature could finally destroy him completely on my exact terms. Monday morning arrived with cold, gray rain washing over the city streets. I stood near the tall windows of the newly established Sullivan Innovation Trust, located on the 4th floor of a highly respected downtown philanthropic building. Exactly at 8 in the morning, the elevator doors opened, and Matthew stepped out into the modest reception area. The custom-tailored Italian suits he wore so proudly last week were completely gone. He wore a simple, wrinkled dress shirt and practical slacks. He walked with his head bowed down, but I could clearly see the deep burning resentment hidden just behind his eyes. He approached my desk and placed a small metal ring on the wooden surface. Attached to the ring were the keys to his expensive imported sports car and the electronic access fob to his luxury downtown penthouse. He had officially surrendered the physical symbols of his stolen wealth just as I had demanded. I looked at the keys and then looked directly at my son. I told him his new assigned vehicle was a standard 10-year-old sedan parked in the visitor lot, and his new residence was a small furnished apartment located in a working-class neighborhood near the industrial district. He nodded slowly, swallowing his immense pride. He forced a weak and completely hollow smile, thanking me again for this incredibly generous second chance. I escorted him down the quiet, fluorescent-lit hallway to his new workspace. It was not a corner office with panoramic city views. It was a standard gray fabric cubicle located directly next to the noisy copy machine. His desk contained a basic computer terminal, a black plastic telephone, and a massive stack of incredibly tedious data entry files. I explained his daily responsibilities in a flat professional tone. He was required to manually verify the mailing addresses of thousands of small charity donors and input the raw data into our legacy spreadsheet system. He would receive a standard 15-minute morning break and exactly 30 minutes for a miserable lunch in the shared staff cafeteria. Matthew sat down in the cheap rolling chair which squeaked loudly under his weight. He immediately picked up a blue pen and began working diligently, nodding his head like a perfectly obedient employee. Over the next 3 days, he put on a magnificent theatrical performance. He arrived exactly 10 minutes early every single morning. He spoke politely to the administrative staff. He even brought me a cup of black coffee on Wednesday afternoon, acting like a humble and reformed man who had finally seen the light. But I watched him closely, through the high-definition security cameras mounted in the ceiling. I watched the way his jaw clenched tight whenever a younger executive walked past his gray cubicle. I saw the pure toxic venom in his eyes when he stared blankly at his computer monitor, thinking nobody was observing his true face. A thief never truly changes his dark nature. They simply learn how to hide their crooked hands behind their backs until the perfect moment arrives. Matthew was not actually working hard to earn my respect or rebuild our broken relationship. He was actively waiting for a golden opportunity to steal his luxury life back. He felt absolutely entitled to millions of dollars, and the agonizing humiliation of sorting mail for minimum wage was building a massive explosive pressure inside his chest. I knew exactly what was waiting for him at the end of his shift. I knew that Samantha was waiting for him every single night in that small working-class apartment. I knew she was whispering pure poison into his ear, demanding he find a way to make them incredibly rich again before she lost her mind. She had married a wealthy chief executive officer, and she was not going to tolerate living the life of a common laborer. On Thursday morning, I decided it was time to finally open the trapdoor and give him the rope he desperately wanted. I called the lead network administrator of my foundation into my private office. I instructed him to install a completely unsecured digital server and place it directly on the shared company network where any employee could easily find it. I ordered him to name the central file directory Project Apex Advanced Solid State Battery Schematics. Inside that unsecured folder, we placed dozens of highly complex and incredibly realistic engineering blueprints. They were completely fake designs, carefully drafted to look exactly like the billion-dollar technology I had just sold to the Global Energy Consortium. To an untrained, greedy eye, those digital blueprints looked like an absolute goldmine worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the corporate black market. I deliberately left the digital security gates wide open. I positioned the juicy bait directly in front of a starving, desperate animal. I sat back in my comfortable leather office chair, sipping my warm coffee, and waited patiently for my son to make the final, fatal decision that would permanently sever him from my life and seal his ultimate fate. The small apartment I had rented for my son was located next to a busy industrial train yard in a forgotten corner of the city. Every time a heavy freight train rolled past, the old single-pane windows rattled violently in their cheap wooden frames. Through the hidden audio devices my private security team had legally installed in their living room, I listened to the inevitable and ugly collapse of their toxic marriage. It was Thursday evening, and Samantha was completely losing her mind over their new squalid living conditions. I sat in my quiet suburban library sipping warm tea while her shrill voice echoed sharply through my headphones. She screamed at Matthew about the miserable condition of their tiny bathroom and the terrible smell of cheap cooking oil leaking through the thin drywall from the neighbors. She reminded him viciously that she had married a wealthy corporate executive who promised her a life of absolute luxury and endless tropical vacations. She was absolutely refusing to live like a common peasant, sorting through discount grocery coupons just to survive the week. Matthew tried to calm her down, using a weak and entirely defeated tone. He pleaded with her to just give him a few more months to win back my trust. He promised he would eventually inherit the massive fortune I had acquired, and they would buy an even bigger mansion than Philip had owned. Samantha laughed a cold and heartless laugh that cut right through his pathetic excuses. She told him he was a complete coward for accepting a minimum wage job from the man who had ruined their perfect lives. She delivered her final brutal ultimatum without a single ounce of hesitation. She told Matthew that if he did not find a way to get their millions back by the end of the month, she was going to pack her designer bags and find a man who actually knew how to provide for a woman of her high status. The heavy silence that followed her threat was palpable. I could practically hear the gears turning frantically in my son's desperate mind. His massive, fragile ego had been completely shattered by her cruel words. He was backed into a dark corner by his own blinding greed and the relentless demands of his incredibly selfish wife. He needed a massive pile of money instantly, and he was completely out of legal options. The very next afternoon, the heavy rain clouds cleared, leaving a bright Friday sky over the city. The Philanthropic Foundation office was completely quiet, as most of the administrative staff had already left early for the weekend. I remained in my private executive suite, intentionally leaving my solid oak door slightly open. Matthew was sitting in his gray fabric cubicle completely alone. He was supposedly finishing his weekly data entry quota, but I knew his mind was frantically searching for a way out of his miserable life. I picked up my secure telephone and called my network administrator, telling him to initiate the final phase of our elaborate plan. The dummy server we had carefully constructed was silently pushed to the front of the shared company network. It was not hidden behind complex passwords or advanced corporate firewalls. It was sitting right there in plain sight, labeled clearly as Project Apex Advanced Solid-State Battery Schematics. I stood up from my comfortable leather chair, grabbed my heavy trench coat, and walked out into the main hallway. I paused right next to my son's cubicle. I looked down at him and told him in a perfectly calm voice that I had an urgent dinner meeting with some wealthy international investors. I mentioned casually that we were discussing the final implementation of my new battery technology and that the detailed blueprints on the server were incredibly valuable to our foreign competitors. I told him to lock the front glass doors when he finished his shift, and I walked out of the building without looking back. I did not actually go to a dinner meeting with international investors. I walked across the street to an unmarked commercial van, where Alexander was already waiting in the dark interior. We sat together and stared at a bright bank of glowing monitors showing the live feed from the hidden cameras positioned directly above my son's desk. Matthew sat completely still for exactly 10 minutes after I left the building. He looked around the empty office floor, making absolutely sure he was completely alone. He stopped typing the boring donor addresses and opened the main network directory on his computer monitor. His mouse hovered over the bright yellow folder labeled Project Apex. He clicked it open. The screen instantly populated with dozens of highly complex engineering diagrams and detailed chemical formulas. To a trained mechanical engineer, the documents were obvious and complete fabrications. To a desperate and greedy amateur like Matthew, they looked exactly like a direct map to $1 billion. I watched his eyes widen to an impossible size as he scrolled quickly through the fake blueprints. He pulled out his cell phone and quickly took a picture of the glowing screen, sending it directly to Samantha. He was undoubtedly telling her that he had just found their golden ticket out of poverty. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a high-capacity silver flash drive. He plugged the small metal device directly into the side of his computer terminal. He did not hesitate for a single second. He did not pause to think about the moral implications of stealing from the father who had just saved him from federal prison. He simply highlighted every single confidential file in the dummy server and dragged them directly onto his personal storage device. The green progress bar moved rapidly across his screen, copying the fake files. In less than 2 minutes, my son had committed severe corporate espionage. He pulled the silver flash drive out of the computer, slipped it deep into his pocket, and practically ran out of the office to find a buyer. Alexander looked at me and offered a tight, grim smile. The bait had been completely swallowed, and the heavy steel hook was set deep in his jaw. Matthew practically ran out of the Philanthropic Foundation building, clutching his leather briefcase against his chest. The heavy silver flash drive felt like a burning coal inside his pocket. He was completely intoxicated by the sheer thrill of his own perceived brilliance. He genuinely believed he had just executed the perfect corporate heist. He walked briskly through the cold evening rain toward the visitor parking lot, where his cheap 10-year-old sedan was parked. He climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors instantly, and pulled out his cell phone. I was listening to his every word through the secured audio feed provided by Alexander. Matthew called Samantha, his voice shaking with pure adrenaline. He told her to start packing her designer bags because he had successfully secured the golden ticket. He promised her they would be sleeping in a 5-star luxury hotel by midnight. He ended the call with a loud, arrogant laugh, completely blind to the terrifying reality that his every move was being carefully monitored and recorded by my security team. Matthew started the engine of his old car and drove out into the heavy city traffic. He was heading toward the industrial district to a specific rendezvous point he had arranged through a dark web corporate broker earlier that afternoon. He believed he was meeting a ruthless executive from a rival international energy consortium who was willing to pay $10 million in untraceable cryptocurrency for the stolen battery schematics. He pulled into a massive concrete parking garage located beneath an abandoned shopping mall. He drove slowly up the circular concrete ramps until he reached the 4th level. The area was completely deserted, just as he had requested. The only sound was the steady dripping of rainwater leaking through the cracked concrete ceiling and the low hum of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. He parked his car in the dark shadows and gripped the steering wheel tightly, waiting for his mysterious buyer to arrive. Exactly 5 minutes later, a sleek black luxury sedan rolled silently onto the 4th floor. Its bright headlights cut through the dark shadows, illuminating my son's nervous face. The car stopped 20 yards away. A tall man wearing a dark tailored suit and a long gray overcoat stepped out of the vehicle. He looked exactly like the kind of dangerous corporate spy Matthew had seen in movies. Matthew took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and stepped out of his cheap car to meet him. They walked slowly toward the center of the empty concrete floor until they stood just a few feet apart. The tall man looked Matthew up and down with cold, calculating eyes. He asked my son in a low, gravelly voice if he had brought the proprietary files from the Sullivan Trust. Matthew smiled a greedy, arrogant smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver flash drive, holding it up in the dim light. He boasted loudly that he had downloaded every single confidential blueprint and chemical formula related to the new solid-state battery project. He claimed proudly that it was incredibly easy to bypass the Foundation security because the old man running the place completely trusted him. He was actively bragging about betraying his own father to a complete stranger. Matthew demanded the immediate transfer of the $10 million in cryptocurrency before he would hand over the physical drive. He stated firmly that he needed to see the digital confirmation on his phone right now or the deal was entirely off. The tall man nodded slowly, showing absolutely no emotion. He reached into the deep pocket of his gray overcoat. Matthew leaned forward, his eyes wide with desperate anticipation, expecting to see a mobile device loaded with millions of dollars. Instead, the man pulled out a heavy black leather wallet and flipped it open. Pinned to the inside of the leather was a bright silver badge reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Matthew froze completely, his greedy smile melting instantly into a mask of pure terror. The tall man did not transfer any funds. He looked directly into my son's panicked eyes and introduced himself properly. He stated that he was a senior private investigator, hired directly by Alexander Reed and retained by Apex Dynamics. He reached up and tapped a small metallic button pinned to the lapel of his overcoat. He informed Matthew that the button was a high-definition, hidden camera and that there were 6 more cameras mounted strategically on the concrete pillars surrounding them. He explained in a calm, chilling voice that every single word Matthew had just spoken was recorded in perfect crystal-clear audio. He noted that Matthew had just openly confessed to stealing highly classified proprietary data from his employer and attempting to sell it to an unauthorized third party for massive financial gain. Matthew stumbled backward, his cheap shoes scraping loudly against the rough concrete floor. the silver flash drive slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the ground. He looked wildly around the empty parking garage, desperately searching for an exit, but a second black vehicle had just pulled up the ramp, completely blocking his only way out. Two more investigators stepped out of the second car, standing silently in the shadows. The lead investigator picked up the dropped flash drive from the concrete. He looked at Matthew and explained the grim reality of the situation. He stated that my son had just committed federal corporate espionage, which carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a maximum security prison. He told Matthew that the authorities were not going to arrest him tonight because his employer wanted to have one final private conversation with him first. The investigator ordered Matthew to get back into his car and drive directly to his former suburban home. He promised that if Matthew tried to run or call his wife, they would immediately forward the high-definition video directly to the federal authorities. Matthew stood in the cold, damp garage, completely paralyzed by fear, realizing that his brilliant heist was actually a perfectly designed guillotine, and the heavy blade had just dropped squarely on his neck. The heavy rain continued to wash over the dark city streets as Matthew drove his assigned 10-year-old sedan away from the abandoned parking garage. He was completely trapped by his own actions, and he knew it deeply. The unmarked black vehicles driven by my private security team followed him the entire way, ensuring he did not make a single desperate attempt to flee the state. But my son was a chronic liar and a fundamental coward to his very core. He could not bring himself to tell his aggressive wife the terrifying truth about his monumental failure. During the agonizing drive to my former suburban home, Matthew had called Samantha on his cell phone. He lied through his teeth, telling her that the wealthy international buyer wanted to finalize the massive cryptocurrency transfer in a completely private and secure location away from the commercial district. He instructed her to take a premium taxi and meet him immediately at the front steps of my old house. He promised her repeatedly that they were walking away with $10 million tonight. Samantha eagerly swallowed the pathetic lie. Her blinding greed completely overpowered any basic logic or reasonable caution. She was ready to collect her massive unearned reward. I was already waiting inside the house. I sat comfortably in my favorite restored reading chair, right in the center of the dark living room. Alexander Reed stood quietly near the cold brick fireplace, his posture perfectly straight and commanding. Flanking the front entryway were two senior detectives from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. They wore dark conservative suits and completely unreadable professional expressions. We waited together in the absolute silence of the empty suburban house. The only sound was the steady rhythmic rain hitting the glass window panes and the slow mechanical ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the hallway. I had specifically chosen this exact house for the final gathering. This was the precise location where Matthew and Samantha had proudly thrown my personal history into a rented dumpster. This was the very floor where they had gloated about their hostile takeover and laughed at my supposed weakness. It was only poetically fitting that their grand, arrogant illusion would officially end on this exact same hardwood floor. Through the large front window, I saw the bright yellow headlights of a taxi pull up to the wet curb. Samantha stepped out, holding a large designer umbrella, and practically ran up the concrete walkway to escape the freezing rain. A few seconds later, the rusted sedan pulled into the driveway. Matthew climbed out, moving slowly and stiffly, like a man walking directly to his own execution. He met his furious wife on the covered front porch. Even through the heavy, solid wooden door, I could clearly hear her sharp, demanding voice. She was complaining loudly about the terrible weather and demanding to know exactly where the $10 million was hidden. Matthew tried desperately to quiet her down, his hands trembling violently as he reached into his wet coat pocket for the brass key. He still had the key to the front door because I had deliberately allowed him to keep it for this exact dramatic purpose. The heavy metal lock clicked loudly in the quiet suburban night. The brass doorknob turned slowly as Matthew pushed his weight against the wood. The front door swung open, bringing a sudden rush of cold, damp air into the dark hallway. Samantha stepped inside the house first, complaining loudly that the mysterious buyer had not even bothered to turn on the exterior porch lights for his wealthy guests. She shook her wet umbrella aggressively and commanded Matthew to hurry up and finalize the corporate transaction so they could leave this miserable neighborhood forever. She took 3 confident steps into the dark living room, completely oblivious to the absolute destruction waiting quietly in the shadows. She was actively planning her luxury tropical vacations while walking directly into a federal trap. Matthew closed the heavy front door behind them, sealing them permanently inside the steel cage. He reached blindly for the wall switch to turn on the overhead lights. The living room instantly flooded with bright, warm light. Samantha stopped dead in her tracks. The expensive, wet umbrella slipped completely from her manicured fingers and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. Matthew let out a sharp, pathetic gasp that sounded exactly like a dying animal choking on its own breath. The arrogant demands completely died in the throat of my daughter-in-law. They were not staring at a wealthy international corporate spy waiting to hand them millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency. They were staring directly at me. I sat completely relaxed in my reading chair, my hands resting calmly on my knees. I wore a perfectly tailored suit purchased with my new billion-dollar fortune. Alexander offered them a cold, professional nod from the fireplace. The 2 federal detectives stepped smoothly out of the dark shadows of the hallway and moved seamlessly to block the front door. Their silver badges caught the bright overhead light, mirroring the exact nightmare Matthew had just experienced in the concrete parking garage. Samantha looked frantically from the armed detectives to the cold face of Alexander, and finally rested her terrified eyes on me. She realized instantly that there was no international buyer, and there was absolutely no massive payday waiting for her. The entire corporate espionage plot had been a perfectly orchestrated illusion designed to expose their true criminal nature. Matthew collapsed to his knees on the hardwood floor, completely unable to support his own weight. The final gathering had officially commenced, and they were completely surrounded by the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. I remained seated in my reading chair, while my son wept uncontrollably on the hardwood floor. I did not offer him a hand to help him up, or a single word of comfort. I simply reached for the small black remote control resting on the wooden side table beside me. I pressed a single button, and the large flat-screen television mounted above the cold brick fireplace instantly came to life. The bright screen illuminated the dark living room with a crystal-clear high-definition video of the abandoned concrete parking garage. The audio filled the quiet space, playing loud and sharp. My son heard his own arrogant voice echoing off the walls of the room. He watched himself standing in the dark shadows, holding the heavy silver flash drive up to the undercover investigator. The hidden cameras had captured every single pathetic detail of his ultimate betrayal. We all listened in absolute silence as the recorded version of Matthew proudly confessed to stealing the proprietary files from his own father. We heard him loudly demand $10 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. We watched him laugh at my supposed foolishness for trusting him with the security of the philanthropic foundation. The video proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his greed was absolute and his loyalty was completely non-existent. Samantha stood perfectly still, staring at the bright television screen in absolute shock. The blinding greed that had consumed her entirely just moments ago was rapidly replaced by a profound and suffocating horror. She watched the tall undercover investigator pull out the federal badge and introduce himself. She watched her husband drop the silver flash drive onto the concrete and stumble backward like a terrified child. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that her husband was not a brilliant corporate mastermind who had finally secured their wealthy future. He was a spectacular fool who had just handed the federal government a perfect recorded confession of a major felony. She looked down at Matthew, who was still kneeling on the floor, with his wet face buried in his shaking hands. The absolute disgust in her eyes was chilling to witness. She realized that the massive fortune she had been promised was actually a 10-year sentence in a maximum security prison. Her luxurious tropical vacations and her expensive designer clothes were completely gone forever. Alexander Reed walked slowly toward the center of the living room. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, demanding immediate attention. He carried a thick black leather folder in his right hand. He stopped directly in front of my kneeling son and opened the heavy cover. He pulled out 2 separate stacks of legal documents and placed them carefully onto the antique wooden coffee table. Alexander spoke in a flat, emotionless voice that offered absolutely no sympathy. He pointed a silver pen at the first stack of papers. He explained clearly that it was a finalized federal criminal complaint detailing multiple counts of corporate espionage, grand larceny, and wire fraud. He noted that the 2 armed detectives standing by the front door were fully prepared to execute the arrest warrant the very moment I gave them the signal. He informed Matthew that the federal prosecutor had already reviewed the high-definition footage and guaranteed a maximum prison sentence. There would be no lenient plea deals and absolutely no chance of early parole for a crime of this magnitude. Matthew began to hyperventilate. He gasped frantically for air with his chest heaving violently under his soaked winter coat. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and begged for mercy. He swore blindly that he would do anything to avoid going to federal prison. He promised to work for free for the rest of his life just to pay me back. He pleaded with me to remember all the good times we had shared and reminded me that he was my only biological child. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow pity. I told him in a quiet, steady voice that my biological child had died the exact moment he handed those fraudulent eviction papers to me at the restaurant. I explained that the pathetic man kneeling on my floor was simply a desperate thief who had finally been caught in his own trap. I leaned forward in my chair and looked directly into his panicked eyes. I told him that I was willing to withhold the federal criminal complaint, but the price for his physical freedom was the absolute and permanent destruction of his entire future. I pointed to the second stack of thick papers resting on the coffee table. I explained that it was a legally binding and completely irrevocable contract of disownment. I told him that if he chose to sign those specific pages, he would permanently sever all legal and biological ties to me. He would voluntarily remove himself from my last will and testament, officially renouncing any future claim to my new billion-dollar estate. He would legally forfeit the right to use the family name in any corporate or private business endeavors. Furthermore, the contract stipulated a strict and permanent order of protection. He and his wife would be legally prohibited from coming within 100 miles of me, my properties, or my philanthropic foundation ever again. He would have to leave this house tonight, with absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on his back, and he would never be allowed to speak to me again for as long as he lived. I told Matthew that he had exactly 1 minute to make his final decision. He could stand up like a man and walk out the front door in heavy steel handcuffs to face the federal justice system. Or he could pick up the black pen resting on the table sign away his entire bloodline and disappear into absolute poverty forever. The heavy silence in the room returned, completely suffocating the remaining air. The slow, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a heavy wooden gavel striking a judge's block. Matthew stared blankly at the 2 stacks of white paper. He looked over his shoulder at the armed detectives standing firmly by the locked door. He looked up at Samantha, who was already backing away from him, as if he were carrying a deadly, contagious disease. He was completely and utterly alone in the world. He had sacrificed his loyal, hard-working father for the illusion of money, and he had sacrificed his own freedom for blinding greed. Now he had to sacrifice his very identity just to survive the cold night. He reached out with a trembling, sweaty hand and slowly picked up the heavy black pen. Matthew held the heavy black pen over the thick stack of legal documents. His hand was trembling so violently that he could barely keep the tip of the pen steady against the white paper. He looked at me one final time, searching desperately for any lingering trace of fatherly affection. He found absolutely nothing but the cold, hard stare of a man who had finally learned to protect himself. Matthew pressed the pen down and signed his full legal name on the bottom line. The scratching sound of the ink against the paper echoed loudly in the quiet living room. With those few messy strokes, he permanently erased his own identity. He officially surrendered every single claim to my billion-dollar estate and legally banished himself from my life forever. Alexander Reed stepped forward smoothly and pulled the signed documents away. He placed them safely inside his leather briefcase, closing the brass clasps with a sharp click of absolute finality. My son was completely disowned. The reality of the signature hit Samantha like a physical blow. The absolute illusion of her wealthy future instantly shattered into a million pieces. She did not rush forward to comfort her devastated husband. Instead, her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. She looked at the pathetic man kneeling on the hardwood floor and completely erupted. Her shrill voice pierced the quiet suburban house as she screamed that he was an absolute failure. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to fall for a fake corporate trap. She paced frantically back and forth, waving her hands wildly in the air. She declared right there in front of the federal detectives that their marriage was completely over. She demanded an immediate divorce, stating that she refused to spend another single day married to a broke, disowned criminal who could not even provide a basic standard of living. Matthew simply stared blankly at the floor, completely broken by her cruel rejection. He had stolen from his own father to please this terribly selfish woman, and she discarded him the very second the money disappeared. Before Matthew could even form a pathetic response, the bright headlights of another vehicle swept across the front windows. The heavy wooden front door swung open violently, hitting the interior wall with a loud crash. Philip Montgomery and my former wife Barbara stumbled into the hallway. They were completely soaked from the freezing rain and shivering uncontrollably. Their expensive designer clothes were ruined and covered in dark mud. They had not come to rescue my son. They had come to demand their share of the stolen money. Philip looked wildly around the living room, breathing heavily. He shouted at Matthew, asking where the $10 million from the international buyer was hidden. Philip frantically explained that local authorities working on behalf of Apex Dynamics had just formally evicted them from their sprawling country estate. They had been physically thrown out into the rain with absolutely nowhere to go. They had rushed to my suburban house, completely depending on my son to save them with his successful corporate heist. Philip suddenly stopped talking. His wild eyes finally focused on the two federal detectives standing firmly in the room. He looked at Alexander Reed, holding the leather briefcase, and then he looked directly at me, sitting calmly in my reading chair. The absolute truth of the situation crashed down upon him. He realized there was no international buyer, and there was absolutely no money. Matthew looked up from the floor and pointed a shaking finger at his wealthy stepfather. My son screamed that Philip had ruined his entire life. Matthew blamed Philip for the illegal loan documents and the corporate espionage, claiming he had been forced into committing the crimes to save their miserable family. Philip completely lost his temper and lunged forward, attempting to grab Matthew by the collar of his wet coat. He shouted that Matthew was a useless coward who could not execute a simple business transaction. Barbara stood frozen near the front door. She looked at my perfectly tailored suit and the cold, absolute control I held over the entire room. She finally realized that the quiet mechanical engineer she had abandoned for a flashy real estate fraud was actually the invisible billionaire who had just completely destroyed her life. She covered her face with her wet hands and began to sob uncontrollably, her loud wailing mixed with the vicious screaming of Philip and Matthew. The three of them tore into each other like starving wild animals trapped in a deep pit. They traded bitter insults and revealed dark secrets, completely turning on one another in their desperate hour of absolute ruin. They had built their entire relationship on a foundation of greed and stolen money, and without that money, they had nothing left but pure hatred. Alexander Reed signaled the federal detectives. The armed men stepped forward and physically separated the fighting family members. Alexander informed Samantha, Philip, and Barbara that they were currently standing on private property legally owned by Apex Dynamics. He presented them with the final formal eviction notices and the strict legal protection orders. He ordered them to leave the premises immediately or face instant arrest for criminal trespassing. The detectives grabbed Philip by the arms and dragged the screaming man out the front door into the freezing rain. Samantha ran out after him, crying hysterically about her ruined luxury life. Matthew was the last one to leave. He stood up slowly from the hardwood floor and looked at me with completely empty eyes. He turned his back and walked slowly out into the dark, wet night entirely alone. The heavy wooden door closed firmly behind him, shutting out the noise of their miserable fighting. The living room was perfectly quiet once again. I sat in my comfortable chair, listening to the steady rain, feeling a profound and absolute sense of peace. The scattering was completely finished. The morning after the final gathering, I returned to the towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. Alexander Reed was already waiting for me in the executive boardroom. The heavy leather folders from the previous night were gone. In their place were pristine blueprints and thick stacks of urban development proposals. It was time to begin the great redistribution. We did not waste a single day. Apex Dynamics had legally absorbed every single asset that once belonged to Philip Montgomery and his fraudulent real estate group. Now we were going to systematically dismantle his empire of lies and build something of actual value over the ruins. Alexander brought in a team of elite liquidation specialists who worked with cold, absolute efficiency. They stripped away the expensive corporate branding from every building Philip had ever touched. They sold off his fleet of imported sports cars and his luxury yachts to international buyers. The millions of dollars generated from those quick sales were immediately funneled into my private holding accounts. We did not keep a single piece of his stolen luxury. We turned his physical greed into pure liquid capital. The most satisfying transformation began with the sprawling country estate where Philip and my former wife had hosted their lavish charity gala. That massive stone mansion, with its crystal chandeliers and pristine swimming pools, represented the absolute peak of their unearned arrogance. Local real estate developers aggressively offered me tens of millions of dollars to purchase the property. I flatly refused all of their lucrative offers. Instead, I contacted the board of directors for the largest public community college in the state. I legally donated the entire 20-acre estate to their educational system completely free of charge. I paid an architectural firm to extensively remodel the property. The grand ballroom where Philip had delivered his pathetic toast was completely gutted and transformed into a massive modern research library. The private tennis courts were paved over to build affordable dormitories for first-generation college students. I stood on the edge of the property months later and watched young, ambitious students carrying heavy textbooks through the same oak doors where arrogant billionaires had once walked. It was a profound and beautiful cleansing of the space. We applied that exact same ruthless philosophy to the rest of his commercial portfolio. Philip had owned several massive downtown apartment complexes. He had become notorious for aggressively raising the rent and forcing working-class families out onto the streets just so he could attract wealthier tenants. Alexander and I completely reversed his cruel policies. We legally bound the properties under a new non-profit management group. We drastically slashed the monthly rent to align perfectly with the local working-class income levels. We used the liquid capital from the sports car sales to completely renovate the failing heating systems and repair the leaking roofs that Philip had completely ignored. Single mothers and hard-working mechanics moved into the clean, affordable spaces that had once been used as collateral for his toxic private loans. Every single time a family moved into a secure home, a tiny piece of the damage Philip had inflicted on the city was permanently erased. The fraudulent real estate empire was gone. In its place stood a quiet, functional system designed to lift people up rather than crush them. The final and most important phase of the redistribution was the creation of my true legacy. I took the remaining capital from the massive energy patent sale and officially established the Sullivan Innovation Trust. I funded the new philanthropic foundation with an initial endowment of $1 billion. I did not want my wealth to simply sit in cold offshore bank accounts gathering useless interest. I wanted to actively search for the brilliant, quiet minds that the rest of the world ignored. We leased a massive warehouse in the industrial district and converted it into a state-of-the-art engineering laboratory. The foundation was specifically designed to provide massive grants and free workspace to young inventors who possessed incredible talent but completely lacked the financial resources to develop their ideas. I spent my mornings reviewing technical proposals from struggling college students and brilliant amateur mechanics who worked out of dusty garages just like I once did. When I found a proposal that showed genuine promise, I offered them complete funding and absolute ownership of their own patents. I became the supportive father figure to dozens of young engineers, giving them the exact encouragement and financial backing I had originally wanted to give to my own son. Matthew had demanded millions of dollars for doing absolutely nothing. These young inventors worked day and night, surviving on cheap coffee and boundless passion. They respected my experience, and they valued my quiet guidance. I walked through the massive laboratory, listening to the hum of heavy machinery and the excited conversations of brilliant young minds. I felt a profound warmth spreading through my chest. The bitter anger and the cold necessity of revenge had completely washed away. I had successfully turned a brutal family betrayal into an engine of endless creation. I kept track of my former enemies, not out of a petty desire for revenge, but to ensure the legal boundaries of my strict protection order were perfectly maintained. My private security team provided me with brief quarterly updates regarding their new miserable lives. The great Philip Montgomery, who once hosted lavish charity galas in a sprawling stone mansion, had experienced the most spectacular fall from grace. He was currently employed at a low-end used car dealership on the dusty outskirts of the city. The custom-tailored velvet jackets he used to proudly wear were completely gone. He now wore a cheap, shiny polyester suit that fit him poorly and trapped the heavy summer heat. The security photographs showed him standing on the hot asphalt for 10 hours a day, desperately trying to convince working-class families to finance rusted vehicles with terrible interest rates. He had become the exact type of predatory bottom feeder he used to loudly mock at his exclusive country club dinners. His former wealthy friends completely abandoned him the very second his bank accounts were permanently frozen. He was entirely blacklisted from the commercial real estate industry due to his massive public fraud scandal. Now he spent his long afternoons sweating under the blinding sun, fetching cheap coffee for a loud, abrasive dealership manager who was half his age. He had absolutely nothing left but a failing, toxic marriage to my former wife, Barbara, who spent her days bitterly complaining about the tiny rented room they shared above a noisy public laundromat. Samantha suffered a completely different kind of agonizing humiliation. She had immediately filed for divorce on the night of the final gathering, desperately hoping to escape the sinking ship and find another wealthy man to fund her luxurious lifestyle. She quickly discovered that her arrogant personality and her complete lack of actual professional skills made her entirely worthless in the real world. Her wealthy socialite friends blocked her phone number and absolutely refused to let her inside their exclusive boutiques. She was currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment located right next to a busy industrial train yard. The thin drywall offered absolutely no protection from the heavy mechanical noise of the passing freight trains. The designer dresses and expensive diamond tennis bracelets she used to flaunt were all swiftly repossessed by angry creditors. She was forced to take a minimum wage job as a hostile customer service representative for a local cable company. She spent 8 hours a day wearing a cheap plastic headset, listening to angry strangers yell at her over the telephone. Her days of ordering expensive caviar and demanding immediate service from frightened waiters were permanently over. She was trapped in a suffocating cycle of poverty and bitter resentment, with absolutely no wealthy savior coming to rescue her from her own terrible choices. But the absolute harshest consequence fell entirely upon my son. Matthew avoided federal prison only because I had kept my legal word and withheld the criminal espionage complaint. However, his physical freedom came with a crushing daily reality. Without his fake technology startup and completely stripped of my financial support, He plummeted straight to the very bottom of the economic ladder. He was currently working the grueling overnight shift at a massive commercial shipping warehouse. He spent his dark nights entirely alone, walking across endless concrete floors, moving heavy cardboard boxes from delivery trucks to wooden storage pallets. The physical labor was brutal and completely unforgiving. His hands, which were once perfectly manicured for corporate boardrooms, were now covered in deep, rough calluses and dark purple bruises. He worked from midnight until 8 in the morning, surrounded by loud, deafening machinery and freezing drafts of winter air. When his agonizing shift was finally over, he took a crowded public bus back to a tiny rented room in a forgotten boarding house. He had no selfish wife to welcome him home. He had no wealthy stepfather to bail him out of his miserable debts. He had absolutely no father to call for vital advice or warm comfort. He was a complete ghost, wandering blindly through a cold and indifferent world. He had willingly sacrificed his only loyal family member for a desperate grab at unearned millions, and he was perfectly rewarded with a lifetime of exhausting manual labor and deafening absolute silence. A full year has passed since the heavy wooden door of my living room closed behind my son for the very last time. I drove my modest 10-year-old sedan down the quiet, familiar streets of my suburban neighborhood. The massive glass skyscrapers of the financial district and the ruthless corporate boardrooms were far behind me now. I had spent decades believing that true success meant escaping these tree-lined streets to provide a luxurious, sprawling estate for my family. I had allowed the bitter complaints of my former wife and the endless greed of my son to convince me that my simple life was a miserable failure. But as I pulled into my concrete driveway and looked at the small 3-bedroom house, I felt a profound sense of absolute ownership. This was not a prison of failure. It was the fortress I had built with my own hands. I did not need a sprawling country estate with crystal chandeliers to validate my existence. I parked my car and walked toward the front porch, breathing in the crisp morning air. The neighborhood was perfectly still. There were no loud moving trucks threatening to throw me onto the street. There were no arrogant relatives demanding the deed to my property under the threat of a psychiatric ward. There was only the gentle rustling of the old oak trees and the warm sunlight washing over the green lawn. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was completely transformed. I had hired a team of professional craftsmen to repair the damage my son and his wife had caused during their brief hostile takeover. I did not fill the rooms with expensive antique furniture or heavy velvet drapes to prove my new billionaire status. I kept the space clean, simple, and completely uncluttered. The most magnificent change, however, was located just outside the kitchen door. I walked across the polished hardwood floor and opened the door leading to my detached garage. For 40 years, this space had been a dark, cramped sanctuary smelling of heavy motor oil and damp concrete. It was the hidden place where I had retreated from the constant nagging of my ungrateful family. Now it was completely reborn. I had used a fraction of my immense fortune to completely renovate the entire structure. The old wooden roof had been replaced with massive glass skylights that allowed the bright natural sun to flood the entire room. The stained concrete floor was now poured white resin. The walls were lined with state-of-the-art engineering tools, pristine workbenches, and advanced digital diagnostic computers. It was a brilliant sunlit laboratory designed for pure creation. I no longer worked in the dark out of desperation to pay someone else's bills. I worked in the bright light out of pure joy. This was where I reviewed the brilliant patents submitted by the young aspiring inventors from the Sullivan Innovation Trust. This was where I spent my quiet afternoons building new engines simply because I loved the mechanical rhythm of the gears turning in perfect harmony. I walked back into the bright kitchen and filled my old steel kettle with fresh water. I placed it on the stove and listened to the familiar soft whistling sound. I prepared a simple cup of black coffee exactly the way I have drank it every single morning for the last 50 years. I did not need imported espresso poured by a nervous waiter in a private corporate club to feel important. I walked slowly through the quiet living room and stepped out onto my front porch. I sat down in my comfortable wooden rocking chair and rested the warm ceramic mug on my knee. The morning sun warmed my face. I watched a neighbor walk his dog down the sidewalk, and he offered me a polite, friendly wave. I waved back, feeling a deep, genuine connection to the simple world around me. The absolute contrast between this moment and the vicious family dinner at the steakhouse was staggering. I took a slow sip of the dark coffee and let my mind reflect on the incredible journey of the last few years. I had survived a profound and devastating betrayal by the people I loved the most. I had learned the hard way that blood does not automatically create a loyal family. Blood only creates an opportunity. True family is built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and shared values. My son and my former wife had worshipped the false god of extreme wealth. They believed that money was a magical shield that gave them the absolute right to hurt anyone they deemed inferior. They completely failed to understand that money is simply an amplifier of true character. When you give a corrupt, greedy person millions of dollars, they simply become a more powerful monster. But when you place vast resources into the hands of a man who knows the actual value of a hard day of work, it becomes a powerful instrument of justice. I had taken their cruelty and forged it into an unbreakable sword. I did not destroy them out of petty malice. I simply removed the artificial cushions that protected them from the real consequences of their own actions and let their own greed consume them. I sat on my porch and listened to the absolute silence of my home. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a lonely old man waiting to die in an assisted living facility. It was the rich, vibrant silence of a man who has finally eliminated all the toxic noise from his life. I had won the ultimate war without throwing a single physical punch. I had secured my legacy not by forcing my corrupt son to inherit my wealth, but by giving it away to young, brilliant minds who actually deserved a chance to change the world. I looked down at my worn hands and then out at the beautiful blue morning sky. The painful illusions of my past were completely gone. Life goes on simple, unshakable, and completely under my own control. I am surrounded by genuine respect, profound purpose, and an absolute unyielding peace. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the balance in a bank account or the square footage of a sprawling estate. Real wealth is the quiet peace of mind that comes from living a life of absolute integrity. I learned that biological blood does not automatically grant someone the title of family. True family must be earned every single day through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and honest sacrifice. Never allow the toxic greed of others to convince you that your quiet sacrifices are worthless. Your dignity is your ultimate asset, and no one can ever steal it without your permission. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more life stories, and let me know in the comments how you have handled the toxic people in your own life.